Welcome to Mental Health Monday. My name is Mick Coyle. Coming up on the programme this week,
we've got a continuing decline in children's wellbeing. We've got the cost of living crisis, and we've also got the impact of the pandemic.
You're able to present as part of this survey the picture as you see it at the moment and as young people are telling you. What are your fears if it's not listened to and actually things stay as they are?
It's a national scandal that we haven't seen a bigger educational recovery program. We've had conversations, at the end of the pandemic to say this is what's needed or to say that we're going to protect children from the impact of the pandemic. But really, we haven't seen much of that follow through.
And I'll be reminding you how you can make connections with mental health organisations within your community. It's Mental Health Monday.
The home of the UK's conversation about mental health. Welcome to Mental Health Monday. My name's Mick Coyle, back for another week and back on track with our news agenda as well. Obviously, the death of the Queen has played a bit of a part in terms of moving things around for us. So the episode from last week, which is still available, I actually went out on the funeral day, but I didn't talk about it on social media on the day itself. With Jake Mills talking about this year's England and Wales suicide figures, still available. You can check that out as well as all the previous 260 plus other episodes of Mental Health Monday. That's available. The week before, we were talking about grief, so that might still be a relevant conversation to you from 2 weeks ago with Tanya Taylor talking about dealing with grief and about how the grief that many people went through when the Queen died might not actually have been related to their own relationship, if you like, with the Queen, but actually bring up some other thoughts and feelings that they had about their own sense of grief. It's a really interesting conversation. This week, we're back on track from a news point of view, if you like, because the Good Childhood Report for 2022 is out, and the people behind it are the Children's Society. We'll hear from the Policy and Impact Manager for Mental Health and Wellbeing, Amy Dix, on this week's programme. She's got loads of stats and facts, and I'll guide you through some of them at the moment. Some of them, though, absolutely heartbreaking. And, it paints a picture of, a difficult world that young people are growing up in at the moment. 1 in 16 children, 6%. 1 in 16 children, that's 6% who are between the ages of 10 and 16 in the UK, are unhappy with their lives. Unhappy with their lives between the ages of under the age of 15 and yet unhappy with their life. And you think 1 in 16, well, that's not that many. 6%, that's not that many. But that's 2 in every classroom. 2 in every classroom unhappy with their lives. And around 1 in 8 are unhappy with school between the ages of 10 and 15. That's really worrying, isn't it? That you've got young people there who are looking at their opportunities, their thoughts and their feelings, and it's becoming a problem for them. It's a really concerning thing. The report also finds that girls significantly more unhappy with their appearance than boys. 1 in 5 are unhappy with the way that they look, compared to 10% of boys. Back in 2012, that was around 1 in 7. Now it's 1 in 5. Young girls looking at themselves and being unhappy with the way that they look. And one of the issues that really comes up in this conversation is the fact that although we're about to enter a cost of living crisis, which young people are already worried about, the pandemic and the impact of the pandemic has also had an impact too, and has had a long-lasting impact, which beyond lockdown and being able to go out and see your friends is having an impact still now and shaping the way that children are seeing the world now, which is really, really concerning. There's a lot in this survey, and there's a lot that young people, I think, are trying to tell us as adults about the world that they see and the way that they would like the world to change. And I think we have to listen to them and open up those conversations. Let's hear from Amy now, because Amy gives us a really decent insight into what the information shows and how we can maybe work with it. She's the Policy and Impact Manager for Mental Health and Wellbeing at the Children's Society. And I started by talking about the fact that given how long the pandemic was affecting children, and of course the age of those children, it's a big proportion of their lives, and it shouldn't be a surprise that it's having a long-term consequence.
Absolutely. So what we're really seeing is we've got a continuing decline in children's wellbeing. We've got the cost of living crisis, and we've also got the impact of the pandemic on children's education. And all of these things, I think, are really on a collision course. so that we just need urgent action now to step in so that we can really protect children from all of these things, but most importantly, make sure that they can have a good childhood going forward. Because really what our research is showing is that significant numbers are unhappy with their lives, and we're talking about their lives overall as well as more specific aspects of their lives as well. So we found that 280,000 children are unhappy with their lives overall, and then over 500,000 children are unhappy with school in particular. So there's really significant numbers on both of those factors. And then on top of that, we also surveyed parents and found that 85% were worried about the impact of the cost of living crisis over the next year. And I think that last figure is kind of unsurprising, really, but we actually think it's probably increased in time as well.
Do you think from a child's point of view, from children's point of view, that actually their worldview is very much shaped by what's gone before, i.e. the pandemic? You know, if you, as a child, you look back beyond 2 years, it's quite a long way into the distance. Whereas actually, you know, from March 2020 onwards, will be very much about how a young person views themselves and the world around them, which is, of course, pandemic focused. And I guess as well, although parents might be aware of the cost of living stuff, that's another potentially impact to come that we'll need to keep an eye out for.
Absolutely. We know that there's a long-term impact of the pandemic on children and young people, and we're waiting to see what comes, and that's why it's so important that we act sooner rather than later and intervene more early. We hear from teachers and others anecdotally that the social and emotional development of children is being noticeably impacted. So children starting primary school, children who are starting into secondary school as well. So that it's definitely on their minds, and it's also going to be on children's minds. We know that children do take on family money worries. Any experience of financial strain does have an impact on children's well-being. So it's absolutely clear that the cost of living crisis, and as more children fall into poverty, they will have a knock-on effect on their well-being.
Let's talk about school life. So you got, 1 in 5 young people unhappy at school. I don't know, school is, if you work it out hour by hour, it's a relatively small part of a child's life. In terms of the influence and the emphasis we put on it, school is a huge priority, isn't it? The idea that we've got high numbers of people, 500,000 young people going into school, unhappy, presumably as a result of that, struggling to engage, and actually, that's not going to end in a positive place, presumably as well. Do you get a sense of what the story is there, if you like, of those young people?
Yeah, so it's very complex, and we don't have a fully clear picture in terms of what's impacting children's experiences of school. We know that the biggest factor that seems to be affecting children's unhappiness is that they don't feel they're being listened to at school. And I think that's a really important finding for us and for schools to be hearing going forward. We also know that children are getting unhappier with school more quickly as they get older. So something's happening at secondary school age for children. And we also know that there's a similar issue for children who are a part of low-income families as well. They're seeing a larger rate of unhappiness compared to children who are from more well-off families. So all of these are really, really helpful insights in terms of what's going on at school. And we do think that school is really important because it can actually have a really protective factor for children if school really takes on that whole school approach to well-being and embeds well-being within every aspect of school life. But there can also be factors that do negatively impact children's well-being in schools. And the things that children tell us about are behaviour policies, school uniform policies, where children just don't understand why they might be being punished for something that they maybe feel like isn't their fault, if they can't afford a certain uniform piece, for example, if they don't feel like their home lives are being factored into how they're behaving at school or where they might need extra support. So children who might have a particularly difficult time at home, come from a more disadvantaged background, they don't feel like their school always understands them. And I think that's a real problem. And it links closely to what I was saying around children not feeling listened to.
And I think there's two take-homes from that, or two questions that it raises for me, Amy, first and foremost, is obviously those children who aren't engaging with school or are unhappy at school, particularly from low socioeconomic background. I wonder how much of that is a hangover from the lockdown period, where maybe they've fallen behind, maybe, or haven't felt like they've been able to keep up with their own classmates. And at the same time, when you talk about maybe our young people and children being listened to, schools who are now obviously trying to play catch up and maybe haven't been able to prioritize maybe some of those well-being factors at a time where they've got to get everyone back up to speed as well. It struck me that maybe there are two things going on there.
Yeah, we don't know for sure, but we definitely hear from our practitioners in our services that work with children that it's the most disadvantaged and most vulnerable children who've been most heavily impacted by the pandemic. In terms of what we want to see happen, though, for children in relation to schools, we want to see a faster rollout of mental health support teams in schools so that children can get help in school more easily. We also want to see early support hubs in local communities so that children can just drop in and get support when they need it without having to join waiting lists as well. And then also within the school context, thinking about the cost of living crisis, we want to see a widening of access to free school meals so that all children whose parents or carers get universal credit can also access free school meals.
Absolutely. And actually, people they can go back in the podcast feed, actually find out about the Fund the Hubs campaign, which is very much up and running. I know you'll be aware, Amy, of what that's all about. What's at stake here, Amy, in terms of the sort of short-term consequences that survey results like this will throw up? But then how does that look sort of medium to long term as well? You're able to present as part of this survey the picture as you see it at the moment and as young people are telling you. What are your fears if it's not listened to and actually things stay as they are?
Absolutely. So if things stay as they are and children can't get the support that they need and continue to be unhappy with school and face growing sort of health and other concerns around the cost of living crisis, the real risk is that inequalities widen in school. That means attainment gaps and at the most basic level. So children, once they start to face inequalities in their educational journey, continue most likely to face these inequalities as they go up through their educational life, which can then really affect their likelihood of getting into university, for example, and their impact their job prospects. There's a lifelong potential impact of not addressing the current well-being concerns, the current impact and the long-term impact of the pandemic as well. And really, I think it's a national scandal that we haven't seen a bigger educational recovery program, that we don't have any strategy for a good childhood in this country, because we've had conversations at the end of the pandemic to say, to say this is what's needed, or to say that we're going to protect children from the impact of the pandemic, but really we haven't seen much of that follow through, and that's it's deeply concerning.
Is it measurable, do you think, or can we create measures, standards that a school, local authority, a government can actually introduce and say, come the end of a school year, you can measure a child by X, Y, and Z and have a meaningful set of data that allows you to then get a better sense of whether or not young people are heading into a better place, or if things, as you've talked about, are in decline.
So what we actually want to see is a more comprehensive measurement of children's well-being, and we want to see that take place at least annually, if not more regularly. And that will allow us to get that much bigger picture of what's going on for children in terms of their well-being. And it will also allow us to capture the experiences of children who currently aren't captured well in surveys, children who might not be in mainstream schooling or who might have disability. It will also help us to understand the experiences of children who may have different sort of intersectional factors in their identity as well. And once we have that wider measurement of children's well-being, it will allow us to really understand the detail of what's going on for children. Also, it will help us to track any emerging concerns as well, to get on top of things that might be coming down the track. But at the moment, we don't have that. And that's a real challenge for policy making around children more generally, but especially their well-being, both at a local and a national level.
Yeah, so like a national well-being measurement seems like a really good idea. One of the things that came up in the survey, I wanted to raise this one, was around how young people feel about themselves and their bodies. A worrying decline in, particularly for girls, around 1 in 5 now who are worried or don't like their body, and that was compared to 1 in 7 10 years ago. Now, straight away, people will go, "Well, that's the social media world," but you and I will remember. Maybe I'm a bit older, I don't know. It was magazines, and it was and adverts and things on TV. So there's always been this thing of girls in particular comparing themselves to other people. But that sharp increase in that relatively short period of time, is there a tie there with social media, or if not, what's the other story there?
Absolutely. So the finding is that 1 in 5 girls are unhappy with their appearance overall, and that has been a really sharp decline, and we are really concerned about it. We can't attribute it all to social media. We haven't got the detail in our research, unfortunately, to be able to pull out the specifics, because there are a number of factors to likely be at play. Generally, research shows that social media doesn't have a hugely significant impact on girls' perceptions and happiness with their appearance. It is a relevant factor, but not the only or the key factor. So other aspects that we need to be aware of are self-esteem, conversations about weight, bullying, ideal body images that we see, and different kind of cultures in the way that we react and discuss gender and appearance in our society. It's definitely something that we need to get on top of. As you say, we've been having these conversations for over a decade, and there's been minimal action to try and bring about any change. And what we therefore need is urgent research to dig into the detail that we don't currently have. We need pilot projects to really understand, to try and put some of that into action, to test what might be working, as well as a wider cross-government strategy to look at what's impacting girls and boys' unhappiness with their appearance. Because I think it needs that cross-government approach. It's not just sort of one department. It really is quite a big aspect of our society.
And when you're hearing from these young people, what are they like in terms of being able to emote what it is that they're going through? I think generationally, people have always been a bit stiff upper lip, but I sense from younger people now they're a little bit more open to this conversation. Are young people, is it easier for them to maybe say, I am unhappy, or I do recognize that my emotion I associate with this is a negative one?
I think the sorts of things that we hear most from young people are conversations around being, feeling the need to be perfect. So that perfectionism comes through quite strongly. We do, interestingly, hear quite a lot from children about social media and their appearance. So that's where the direct conversations we have with children don't necessarily marry up to what some of the research is telling us. And it's really interesting, but we don't really have the answer. And that's why, unfortunately, kind of more research is needed in that space.
No, absolutely as well. And I sense as well that this idea that to measure something in a child actually would allow us then to take things into adulthood, because you only need to look at the latest suicide stats, where we're seeing an increase in young girls 15 to 19 up to the age of 24 taking their own life. Still a relatively small number, but as a percentage increase was high. Even when we get into men in their 50s, where if we could track and measure their emotional states across a lifetime, I think again we would be in a much better decision. I think the politicians would also be in a much better decision to be able to make decisions about a better position, rather, to make decisions about people, knowing what it is that they are going through, knowing it is about how they feel about themselves and the world around them, and probably then how they're likely to respond to major changes and things that might be coming their way.
We have some really interesting data from previous Good Childhood reports on this, where we found that asking children at age 14 about their life satisfaction and measuring life satisfaction was a really good indicator of how they would then feel at age 17. So children who were unhappy with their lives at age 14 were more likely to face sort of depressive symptoms, anxiety, or even sort of self-harm at age 17. So we do have a lot of really useful data in this area. But what we're seeing is a lack of action and a lack of prioritization of children and young people's mental health and well-being. And one thing that we want to make a case for is, we're really supportive of the work that the Department for Health and Social Care is currently doing to develop a mental health and wellbeing plan. But we're concerned that it might not be prioritised because we've seen a recent change to government ministers, for example. But most importantly, we also want to see children and young people at the heart of that plan. We don't want children and young people to just be an add-on to something that's for adults, because that they need to be centered, and the focus needs to switch to children and young people to really prevent this, really devastating decline that we're seeing in children's well-being and happiness.
I think the other thing is, if you are a politician looking at this, do you think, well, 1 in 5 are unhappy at school, let's wait until it's 1 in 4 before we do anything, and the stat, you mentioned it right at the top, but it's heartbreaking. You got 1 in 16, I think it is, are unhappy with their lives. Now, no child at any age within childhood should have to feel that way about their position on the planet. Like their existence is one of unhappiness. That's incredibly troubling, that. And even if it is, even if it's only 6%, for only 6%, I'll show you 2 kids in every classroom then who feel that way about themselves. And then suddenly you go, all right, well, it's 2 in every classroom. Are we going to wait until it's 3 in every classroom before we say something more needs to be done?
It's absolutely heartbreaking, as you say, and we really need to be more ambitious in what we want childhood to look like for children in this country, and to take ownership and make urgent action come to life.
Amy, thank you so much for your time. It's a really fascinating survey as ever, and we'll put a link as well in the notes to the podcast so people can read into it themselves. And I'm sure there's plenty more different conversations to have off the back of this. But as ever, thank you for the great work you do through the Children's Society, and I'm sure we'll speak again very soon.
Thank you so much.
I hope you've enjoyed this week's podcast. Thanks for checking out Mental Health Monday. My name is Mick Coyle. You can find me on Twitter at Mr. Mick Coyle. You can also find me, Mick Coyle, on Facebook as well. Don't forget, if you want to speak to somebody about your mental health, you can do so. The Samaritans, free to call on 116 123. You can find mental health services where you are. Just look for the Hub of Hope. Type in your postcode. It'll find those mental health services close to you. And for support in a crisis, you can text SHOUT to 85258. That's if you're experiencing a personal crisis, you're unable to cope and need support. Shout to 85258. That's a text line. Do get involved in those services. In an absolute emergency, always remember the number to call is 999. Thanks for downloading the podcast this week. We'll be back next week with more Mental Health Monday.